Lux Artaene by Gheorghe Ligeti was composed in 1966. Lux Artaene was composed in 1966. Lux Artaene was composed in 1966. There's that echo again. I wonder what it might mean. Perhaps the date of this composition is somehow significant, and in fact it is. This work, as I've already told you, has figured prominently in at least one branch of popular culture, the movies. And this work brought Gheorghe Ligeti to international attention, and to the attention of an audience he might not have otherwise had, when this composition was used in the soundtrack of the 1968 Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey. It is a classic of science fiction film. Elements of this film caused quite a sensation when this movie premiered in the late 1960s. And one of its most striking features is the use of this composition in it. And I really do want you to remember that it was written a mere 10 years after Ligeti moved to the West. Basically, Ligeti, like other artists from former Soviet bloc countries, moved to the West not only for artistic freedom, but also to gain artistic recognition. And certainly Ligeti succeeded very early on, very much like many of the others who did the same around that time. So he moved to the West in 1956. This composition was written 10 years later in 1966. He moved to the West in 1956. This composition was written 10 years later in 1966. You get the idea, don't you? Lux Artaene is a Latin title, and it is a song from the Requiem Mass, which, as you already know from having taken a look at Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, the Requiem Mass is the Mass for the dead. In the Berlioz work, we looked at the sequence from that composition, the Dies Irae. We're going to take a look at another song of the Mass propers in this composition. Indeed, Lux Artaene is the communion from the Requiem Mass. It is one of the Mass propers. And isn't it interesting that the Mass propers, or the propers of the Requiem Mass, have inspired composers? And that songs from this service, and their settings by high art music composers, have appeared so prominently in popular culture. Indeed, we hear this particular song in the soundtracks of movies, and wonderful settings of the sequence Dies Irae from the Requiem Mass can be heard in the soundtracks of movies, as well as that of commercials and television shows as well. So let's take a closer look at this song from the Mass propers of the Requiem Mass. Now, the performing forces for this composition are significant. And in fact, if you know the performing forces of this work, you have some idea of how the work is actually constructed. This certainly has extravagant performing forces, at least in a traditional view of things, because it requires not only a choir, but 16 solo singers. Now think about that. 16 solo singers. How many choral works do you know of that require 16 soloists in it? There's something decidedly exotic about this. But interestingly enough, there is nothing at all unusual about this large number of soloists in a sound complex composition. So let's take a look at what is meant by a sound complex composition. Now, the composer of this work himself, when describing it, said that it contained passages in which sections of mistiness are contrasted with passages of clearing up. And he goes on to define mistiness as follows. He says, mistiness usually means a contrapuntal texture with a micropolyphonic cobweb technique. With all due respect to the composer, this is absolute nonsense. In fact, it's absolute blather. Indeed, the phenomenon that he's trying to describe here is one that can be understood and described in far, far simpler terms. A sound complex composition is perhaps best understood as a work in which textures are continually expanding and contracting. You have at hand a little table that describes each of these textures or these tendencies in a piece, along with little diagrams that show expanding up and down, expanding upward, expanding downward, contracting upward, contracting downward, etc. Let's take a look at the second of these in the top row, the one that says expand upward. And here I will tell you what would happen in a passage of a work that has this particular tendency in it. And this is a good time to recall the performing forces for this work. 16 soloists in addition to a choir. Let us say that the first soloist begins singing a note. A second later, the second soloist sings the note above that. A second later, the third soloist sings a note above that. A second later, another soloist sings a note above that one, and so on, until all 16 soloists are singing perhaps at 16 different pitch levels, each of them entering one after another, each one singing a higher pitch. Basically what we have here is an expanding texture defined by the number of voices. It starts out with one voice, increases to a two-voice composition, to three voices, four voices, five voices, etc., up to 16 voices. Now, isn't that easy to follow? It's simply expanding and contracting textures, and these expansions and contractions are determined or effected by the number of voices that are singing them. Clearly, the composer of this composition, or the composer of such a composition, is manipulating texture. And so Ligeti in this composition, and like compositions of his, is preoccupied with texture. That's exactly what he's dealing with. And such works are very interesting. The product of them is very interesting indeed. They tend to be highly dissonant. Well, dissonant at least in the conventional sense of it, in the tertian harmony sense anyway. And when you have a dozen different notes sounding together, there is no focus on one or the other or a pair or a trio of them, and they all blend into one sound. And honestly, when I first saw this movie, I was terribly young at the time. I had no idea that the buzzing noises that I was hearing actually were those of a musical composition. And I wonder how many people who've seen the passage in that particular movie actually recognize those sounds to be a musical composition. So when you hear a piece of this source that has expanding and contracting textures, you know that you're dealing with a sound complex composition.